Good evening, and welcome to Hello, It's Us. Hello, It's Us is dedicated to educating the general public about issues that are important to the disability community, and it's our premise that as we discuss these issues, you, the viewership, will understand that they are important to everyone because people with disabilities are a part of the community. Hello, It's Us is brought to you through a collaboration between the University of Iowa Center for Disabilities and Development, our friends at Uptown Bill's Coffee Shop, and the good people here at Public Access TV. My name is Mike Hoenig. I work at the Center for Disabilities and Development here in Iowa City, and I serve as one of the co-hosts for Hello, It's Us. Keith?
My name is Keith Ruff. I'm a self-advocate for disabled issues, and I'm retired, and I'm writing a book.
Getting a little closer to completion of that?
Yeah.
Well, we're happy to welcome our panelists back here and all of our viewers back to part 2 in our mini-series on mental illness. We have a great esteemed group here in the studio with us. I'll just introduce them real quickly, and then we'll just jump right back into questions that we want to hear their input. We have Margalee Warner, who is a peer-to-peer advocate with the ComPeer program here in Johnson County. Welcome back, Margalee.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for being here. We have Phil Steffensmeyer, who is board president of NAMI of Johnson County. Thank you for coming back and being here with us, Phil.
Thank you for having me.
We have Bo Pinkham with the Crisis Center. With the Crisis Center. He's the Crisis Intervention Program Coordinator there. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you,
Bill. We have Jessica Peckover, who is with the Johnson County, Jail Alternatives Coordinator. Jessica, thanks so much for coming back and joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. And Kathy Johnson, who's the Executive Director of the Abbey Center, which I was going to say Cedar Rapids, and that's certainly where she's based, but we learned last time that they cover a 9-county area, which is quite amazing to me. But thank you so much for coming back and joining us, Kathy.
Absolutely, thank you.
All right.
I have one question to start off with. How is managed care impacted services for mental illness? Anyone?
Kathy?
Well, I certainly have been impacted by managed care in terms of being a service provider. At this point, it's still fairly new.
Yeah.
Personally, our agency has not experienced cuts in terms of the managed care not authorizing services.
Oh, that's good.
Getting payment for services, there have been many snags in that process. So that's probably been the biggest challenge in the last year, is just getting reimbursed for the services that you have provided.
And I would say I'm not a traditional provider in that I would bill Medicaid or managed care. I tend to be a referral and linkage resource. And I would say one of the challenges, there are good things that come with it. One of the challenges is that access to care, it adds another layer. So when we're trying to get people connected to funding, and we've talked about stigma and barriers, and that 60% of people with mental health disorders aren't accessing services. But when somebody finally says, I want to get help, and then we have 5 different layers to get there, we're kind of going the other direction. So I would say that's one of the challenges, is that getting people funding and getting services in place, it's one step removed. It's an additional step in there, and that's one of the challenges I've seen from my end of things.
That's a big challenge.
Couldn't that be a real hindrance to people who need service now, not later?
I would say yes, and I would say that there are certainly strategies in place to help with that. While some of those things are pending, we've been fortunate enough that our mental health region, as you may or may not know, we're in a 9-county mental health region, and they will step in to try to help fund some things while things are pending. I don't know if that's the case in every region in Iowa, but we have that here.
That's a good thing. It's a safety net for sure. That Anybody else want to comment on managed care?
You know, the only comment I'll add to that is that, you know, we've had managed care in Iowa for the last 20 years on the
Yeah.
behavioral health side. The new part really is the fact that this new managed care system is supposed to be integrated. And so it's supposed to be coordinating your health care with your behavioral health needs. And the system has a long way to go in realizing that integration, but I think that was the purpose of the new managed care system, was to do that integrated care.
Well, it certainly sounds like a good model. It's just getting the implementation going on, and you know, it kind of goes back a little bit to what we talked about in our time together earlier about, you know, with physical health, with
Right.
physicians and so forth actually implementing mental health screeners. You know, that's one of many ways that things can be integrated. But I mean, just the recognition that mental health is health. So, I wanted to jump back a little bit to Jessica you commented a little bit about, you know, that certainly getting access to services and getting them in place is a barrier that people with mental illness often face. And I would just like to toss the question out to all of you to comment on what some of the barriers that people with mental illness face. Obviously, there's no, you know, when you've seen one person with mental illness, you've seen one person. But just in general, what some of the barriers that people must deal with on a daily basis. We've touched on several of them just in the conversation here, and then go ahead and talk a little bit about what your agency or organization, how you work to address some of those barriers, and just let's see where we head here.
I can mention a few things here. You know, certainly we've talked about how 60% of folks who might be really struggling with some symptoms of mental illness are not seeking services. And we've talked last session about stigma and some of the things that might prevent people from reaching out and accepting help. I think you know, certainly we do run into things like long waiting lists maybe to get into certain types of services. We also have talked about the fact that mental illness can be cyclical. And so some days you may feel like, okay, this is it, I've got to get help, and you make a call, and if you make an appointment for 3 weeks down the road, 3 weeks comes and you're feeling better, so you don't go. And so one of the things our agency has changed is we are trying to go to more of a same-day access service. So for that very first time somebody's reaching out to establish care, we are allowing them to pick their day, that they can come in on a day that is right for them, and we'll do that initial assessment and come up with those treatment recommendations right on that same day.
Oh, that's good.
So in Johnson County, we have that available 3 days out of the week. In Cedar Rapids office, we have that at 5 days a week. But what we have found is that people are coming in with much more higher levels of distress because they are coming in when the issue is real and it's hitting today and I need help today.
Wow, that's terrific. That's, you know, getting it at the start, or getting it when it's in an acute phase. It sounds like that's a real move in the right direction. So,
Mike, I've known friends to go to the emergency room here in Iowa City and have no beds. One friend stayed in the emergency room for 48 hours and then got sent to Waterloo. I know there was a time we were talking about having a mental health emergency room, especially a place where you could go and maybe just get some rest. I know my illness is always more unmanageable when I haven't had enough sleep. If I could go to an emergency room and instead of putting me back on the streets, if they said, here's a bed, get some rest, it might work.
Well, and I would piggyback off of that. That ties nicely into a lot of the projects that we're working on right now at Jail Alternatives. And I would start with a stat. I'm not usually a numbers person, so that would surprise people who know me. But nationally, they would say that people who present to the emergency rooms for behavioral health crises crisis, about 70% of them could be better served somewhere else. Most people would say the ER is not a great place to be. Maybe Margaret and Phil could speak to this. It's not a great place to be if you're in a mental health crisis. So in Johnson County, we've been looking at kind of something we've been calling a behavioral health emergency department, or a crisis access center, a crisis restoration center. And the idea is that we would have a crisis triage that you could be seen quickly within 15 minutes of arriving. And we would have things like crisis observation, a place that you could rest, crisis stabilization. They will mention often that in the first 3 days of a crisis, you just want to sleep. And what that does is it frees up those beds in inpatient psych and in the ER for people. Some people really need inpatient psych, and if we had the spectrum of services more filled elsewhere, then those folks who actually need inpatient psych aren't having to wait for 48 hours in the ER. They're not having to go to Sioux City and Council Bluffs. So if we could address some of those, as Margaret said, maybe I just need a rest. If we had a safe place for that, it doesn't bottleneck at the other end of the spectrum. So we're making some efforts there. We have a lot of interested parties, and the municipalities are very interested, a lot of key decision makers in our community. So there's a lot of people looking at that and working on that, and a lot of partnership that's sitting up here at the table.
That's really exciting to think about making that happen. And maybe if anyone would like to echo what you were just talking about, the ER and a mental health crisis. I mean, that's about the last place I'd want to be when you think about all the commotion going on and the noise. And I think it would. I had to go there for a physical situation a few years ago, and I felt like I was in crisis by the time I left. I mean, it's depressing. It's and people are doing their jobs, but it's just there's so much going on there.
Yeah, at the crisis center, before we had mobile crisis start up last year, we had it wasn't really well advertised, but we would do hospital advocacy, where if someone was having thoughts of suicide and went to the ER, we could send an on-call volunteer out there to just be with them, be part of the process, kind of just like be a little advocate for them if need be. And I did that a few times in my role as an on-call volunteer. And everyone at the hospital, their hearts are in the right place, but generally they do the exact same kind of risk assessment that we do on our crisis services, and then they just have access to maybe a psychiatrist on call who's like, okay, here's an antipsychotic, and they would give them one medication, and then if there was no beds, and there generally were never any beds, the person would be kind of shown to the door, with a pat on the head. And it was unfortunate. It was also unfortunate I wasn't allowed to give them rides home, so that was an awkward conversation. But it really shows that mobile crisis has come a long way in our area, as far as kind of its entire purpose is to keep people out of the ER who are having mental health or suicide crisis. And the nice thing is that if you really look at the numbers, nitty gritty, it saves money. It saves the county and the state a lot of money to keep people who are going through those kinds of crises out of the ER, and instead maybe utilizing the crisis stabilization units that we have in the area now, which are just wonderful. And that CAC that you were talking about, Jessica, God, that can't come soon enough. That's gonna be a real lifesaver for a lot of people.
I have a friend who basically slept through a 7-day hospitalization. She said it was the most expensive nap she ever took.
Oh, jeez.
That's true.
Yeah.
How are we, or how are they reaching out to the world of the homeless? When I'm on the Padmore, I do see a lot of homeless, and a lot of them do indicate that they have a mental illness of one kind or another. What is the type of outreach, if any, to reach the homeless?
That is a big issue, and I know Abbey Center actually received some federal funds for it's called a PATH grant, and the purpose of that grant is to provide outreach we have a social worker who does go out into the community and visit meal sites or housing or shelter areas, and sometimes even parks where people might be lodging for the night. and really tries to find folks that are experiencing homelessness and to talk with them and try to assess whether there's mental health needs so that we can get them plugged into services.
And I would say another effort in that is maybe it's not obvious, but I think it's obvious, is that getting law enforcement trained in crisis intervention team training. So when they're out, they're the ones who are out on the street. They're the ones who are seeing people. They're the ones who are dealing with individuals and helping individuals who are experiencing homelessness. And now they'll be even more trained to be aware of signs and symptoms of mental illness. And one indicator we have of increasing access to care is that since we started mobile crisis and we've started getting a few officers trained in CIT training, we've seen, I think the first July when we didn't have any CIT officers trained, I think we had 13 calls to mobile crisis. The following July when we had about 15 CIT officers trained, there were close to 40 calls for service to mobile crisis, and about 25% or 30% of those were from law enforcement. So I think you're going to see that increased front door access to care. I would also say that our homeless service provider, the Shelter House, does provide some permanent supportive housing for people who are experiencing homelessness and have a mental illness. So, between the mental health center, Shelter House, there are various agencies that are trying to address it.
Can you, and I think we've touched on this on both programs, excuse me. In terms of the way that mobile crisis works, can you walk us through how Bo or Jessica or whomever talk about how I assume a call comes in maybe to the crisis center and then somebody is dispatched, is triaged out to the person? Is that how that works? Or
Yeah. Do you want to find me over it? Or I can take it. Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. So, and I'm not an expert in it, but yeah, the way it works is it's all funded through the region. So generally people have to be part of the 9-county mental health region that we're in. And they can access us basically through any services so long as they're part of that region. And what happens is we'll see if they're actually requesting mobile crisis, we don't make any judgment call on our end. We'll just be like, okay, let me transfer you over. But otherwise, if it sounds like, they're at a space where our regular crisis counseling isn't doing enough to kind of get them through their immediate crisis, and maybe they would benefit from some face-to-face counseling of some kind, we transfer them up to a dispatch center in Cedar Rapids, and then eventually 2 trained crisis counselors would go out and meet them either at their home or wherever they want to meet, wherever there's most comfortable for them, and generally just spend, I think the average time is 2 hours with a client or something, which, our average phone call is about 20 minutes. So that's a very extended period of time,
Right.
Really just taking the time to really meet the person where they're at and see what we can do. And sometimes, most often that interaction, the person can figure out a plan for staying safe and, getting through the crisis themselves. Sometimes they would request going to the crisis stabilization unit, especially if their crisis involves something at home, which it can very much entail. Very, very not often will it actually mean that they need to go to the ER, but they do a risk assessment for suicide or violence against others. But yeah, so it's always 2 counselors, and it's just been such a great service. I can't speak about it enough. It's been game-changing in the area.
And since we have an audience, I guess I would want to share how people can access
Absolutely.
this. There's
Yes.
the Iowa helpline, and so there's a phone number. I think it's 800-855-1239. Am I right? Check me.
Yep.
So anyone
Good
can
job.
call. The person in crisis can call. A care provider, a loved one, a family member, law enforcement, anybody can call and request mobile crisis outreach. And the other thing I would add is that not only do you have the on-call crisis response and they'll address the crisis in the moment, but there will be a follow-up call within 24 hours. And that's so key from a care coordination perspective. If they help them set up a psych appointment, they'll also follow up and say, hey, you have an appointment tomorrow. Do you have transportation to get there? You still want to go? So there's a lot of value and benefit of getting connected. You'll have a little bit of continuity of care there. So
Yeah.
I would echo what Bo said, that it's just been an invaluable resource for our community.
Do some of the individuals experiencing mental health have a flexibility in tailoring their services to their present needs?
Can you repeat that? Do they have flexibility in what?
in tailoring their services to their specific needs.
Yeah, so like if you're, you got it?
I think you're asking, does somebody who needs services have a lot of input on tailoring the services to their
Yes,
specific needs?
Yeah,
but-
and kind of connecting that with, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, just in connecting it with their payment plans, you know, in terms of insurances, if, you know, can you base it, can services be tailored based on, you know, we've talked some about mental health disorders being cyclical. So at times, you know, we obviously needing more intense services than others, and how well does our service system and our payment system allow that to happen, if that makes
Yes,
sense.
that's about it.
You know, that's an interesting question, and there's probably lots of different ways you could answer that. But, you know, one of the things that strikes me is that I think we have a lot of options in Johnson County as far as levels of care and, you know, people receiving more or less services. But one of the things that strikes me is that a lot of the intensive services that people receive, more of those home and community-based services, are funded by Medicaid. And so if you are an individual that's on a private insurance, all the service options are not available to you. Now, there are some services, particularly, you know, Bo's talked a lot about the crisis services, where there's not a charge for that. That's something that is supported by the region. But many of the services do depend on, you know, whether you have Medicaid or whether you are on a private insurances. Private insurances have not expanded their benefit packages to include the more intensive services.
Do we think that they ever will?
You know, I think the University of Iowa, with their impact program, has been a little successful in getting one commercial payer to cover them. We have had some success on a case-by-case basis. If you have somebody with private insurance that is, you know, the intensity of their symptoms is such that they're in the hospital a lot, sometimes you can get some allowances for some individualized kind of benefits, but more often than not, no. If it's not a covered benefit, they just won't pay for it.
Whether it'll get better or not, that's a really large question.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's really, you know, money and data talks. So it's really, we just have to keep making that connection that nobody's out on an island as far as, you know, I only have mental health issues and no physical issues, or I only have physical issues and no mental health issues. It's all holistic when you get down to it. And so the more that we can prove, kind of like what Kathy was saying, you know, sure, it's a diagnosis of depression, and so it's easy for you to say we won't cover that, but since that person is now going to the hospital over and over and over again, does that not basically equate to a physical issue, you know? And why is there just this difference in how we treat it?
Why is the brain less valuable and important than anything else?
You know, and I often think about people who go to the dentist at least once a year to get a checkup. You know, shouldn't we be at least once a year going in for a mental health and emotional checkup?
Exactly.
That's a great point. I also think that we still have a ways to go in terms of insurance companies really getting it about the holistic nature of mental and physical health. I know that my mother, when she was really working to recover from a pretty serious episode of depression, had a fall and broke her pelvis. And so she had to, in order to be able to access in-home nursing care through Medicare, she had to be homebound. And once the health, you know, and so that presented a problem because you know, the last thing we wanted to do is to isolate her. And yet, in order for her to get the physical supports that she needed at the time, that's what had to happen. And I don't know if some of those laws have, you know, some of those provisions have gotten a little better, but I found that to be extremely frustrating.
Well, let's hope we can get these companies to react faster, because you could think to cut something in the bud is better than letting it grow.
Absolutely.
I wanted to go back to something perhaps a little less of a challenging subject and something that's kind of fun. During our first episode together, Margalie and Phil, you talked about various types of trainings and supports that are available through Compeer and NAMI and other organizations. And so I'd like to expand on that a little bit. Margalie shared with me before the show that how important coping strategies are, and how just that kind of piggybacking a little bit on the holistic piece, that just being able to get support in the community is really important. And I'd like to invite the two of you to talk a little bit about that. I know, Margalie, you've got a sort of a graphic that you like to use to talk about your success and also about the many ways that you've reached that success. Would you be willing to talk?
Not only am I a person with mental illness, I'm also a poet. So I'm always throwing images around. And about 5 years ago, I thought, my friends who have AA experience make a big deal about anniversaries of sobriety. And a friend of mine, we even have a drink contest on her anniversary of sobriety where we prepare the most delicious non-alcoholic beverages we can, and she ranks them and chooses the winners, and their consolation prizes for people who thought that perhaps almond milk with a little cayenne pepper. Well, anyway.
Don't invite me to that one.
I felt I needed a symbol of wellness, and I've been out of the hospital now for 21 years. Before that, I would say I was a revolving door patient. I was in and out of inpatient psych. I needed to be there. I was suicidal. My illness was flaring, and I hated to be there. I really hated to be there. And as the years passed without a hospitalization, I began to develop some coping skills. And so I asked my friends to go through their collection of keys and randomly give me keys, and I found out I had exactly the number of keys as I had out of the hospital. And then I used to carry them around on a keychain, and they were really heavy. And so finally, friends of mine said, you need a shadow box, and they were kind enough to help me find one. And it's got a beautiful red velvet background. And the keys themselves are interesting keys. Some of them are antique keys. One of them is a car key. I just don't know where it's parked. One of them is not a key at all. It's a fingernail file, which stands for think outside the box. You could use it to pick a lock in a pinch. One of the keys, the largest key, which my picture is much smaller than the shadow box. The shadow box is about 3 foot by 2 foot. And the largest key is a key that my friend gave me from the old psych hospital quiet room. It fills both of my hands. It is heavy, and it symbolizes to me the time that I was placed in the quiet room and what a quiet place it wasn't. I was so frustrated being there. They told me to change into a hospital gown, and instead of unbuttoning my blouse, I just ripped it off, and all these buttons flew around the room.
Fun way to get it done. Well,
I don't know that I was in danger. I think I was becoming a nuisance.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry we're cutting close to the end of time here, and I wanted, Phil, did you have anything that you'd like to add just in terms of coping strategies or supports or things?
Sure. My biggest coping strategy is just simple deep breathing and meditation. Something that really adds to my just well-being, and I think Margalie will vouch for this as well, is animals, pets.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Something to keep you grounded, something to help you stay focused, something like that. A big function that NAMI serves is that we have Our Place, which is a drop-in center for people with mental illnesses. And there's often a good discussion going on there about different coping skills and how people have adapted to their own situations and what we can learn from each other.
That's terrific. Well, those are some great strategies. We're cutting up on time. I know we've provided some resource information for the crisis line. Is there any other phone numbers, whether it be the Abbey Center, or we can always place information, we can embed contact information visually, but would anyone care to share? Are there additional numbers that people should know about if they needed, or websites that people can contact with your respective agencies or groups?
The I'm sorry. The Abbey Center's telephone number is 338-7884.
Thank you. And how about, I know NAMI Johnson County, I know you have its website. It was NAMI.
Yeah. www.namijc.org. That's NAMIJC.
Okay.
Our place, that's the letter R place, is at 10 East Benton Street.
Oh, great. We're not too far from there. Well, I want to thank all of you again for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. It's been an enlightening, very quick, fast-moving time together. We really appreciate your expertise, your openness, and your willing to share with us today. And we hope you, the audience, have enjoyed it, and we'll tune in again next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good week out there.
Thank